My name is Gerard Baker. I'm a Mandan Hidatsa Indian. My Hidatsa name is Zesashidish, and Zesashidish means yellow wolf. I was named by one of my clan grandfathers when I was very, very young, of course. I'm 6'5". I have white hair now, braids, and I'm dark skinned. For those of you that cannot see, dark skinned, and which is not a tan, by the way. I'm a full-blood Hidatsa from the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation. Worked for the Park Service for roughly about 40 years, actually, altogether. And been retired for a little over 10 years now. I was one of the first American Indians from our reservation to ever be in the National Park Service. And I was probably the second American Indian to be a superintendent of the National Park Service. So I'm very proud of that fact. Started out my career primarily at Knife River Indian Village's National Historic Site. I was the superintendent at Chickasaw Recreation Area when I got the call from Washington, D.C., the Washington office, and saying they were putting together a bicentennial of Lewis and Clark. And they were not sure yet how they were going to do it. And they wanted to know if I would be interested in leading that role, not only being the superintendent of the Lewis and Clark Trail, but primarily putting together the Tent of Many Voices and a mobile unit that we were going to go across country. Because when I came on board, we knew that there was going to be, that's how I was hired, a bicentennial for the Lewis and Clark. And when I first came on board, they were calling it a celebration. The DC folks and the heads of the Park Service and stuff were calling it a celebration. And it was unique because if you look at that time period, there was really nothing going on in this country. Luckily, there was no natural disasters. There was no issues with any countries, foreign countries. So there was really nothing happening. So we were the show. The bicentennial, I'm saying we being the bicentennial, was the show for Lewis and Clark. And so when I got hired, they said we were going to plan on somehow going with the Lewis and Clark time period in a day-to-day experience, if you will, meaning that we would go from one area to another, just like Lewis and Clark did in 1803 and 4. And so they had a vehicle. They said they had a vehicle together, that they had pictures of the vehicle, and we were still looking at when I got there, but they had no concept. And so this is how the concept got started. I struggled with it for a long time because I knew we wanted to talk about Lewis and Clark. I knew they wanted to talk about the tribes, but I never heard that much discussed at that point. And so when I came in, my objective was to really bring the tribes to the head. And it was interesting because one of the first meetings I went to where we discussed with some of the tribes from mainly the West Coast, sat there, and I noticed one thing that was very disturbing. I noticed that the National Park Service was dictating to the tribes what they wanted them to do. And I thought that was very incorrect. Government, here we go again. Government telling the tribes what to do. And so I sat through the first meeting, and yes, we were very proud of the fact that the Midwest region, where I was representative of, Midwest region was tasked with the commemoration, or at that time they said the celebration of Lewis and Clark. And so I came and talked to them, and I said, the first thing we're going to reorganize and we're going to rethink is that this is not a celebration. There's some people that, they were excited about going up and seeing the boats go around that corner, going with Lewis and Clark and discovering the tribes, discovering the natural resources, discovering this, discovering that. And I took a different tone. I looked at it and I said, what would be really interesting is that let's, instead of being with Lewis and Clark on those canoes and on those pirogues as they go upstream, let's be in those Indian villages when those guys come around the corner. Let's be and experience that. What did the tribes experience? How did it change their lives? And I can remember one night I remember sleeping, and I continued to think about, how am I going to do this? How am I going to interpret this? How are we going to do this to make it visible, to make it educational, to make it long lasting for the American public and for our students and for our children of every color? And so one night I remember I woke up, and I tell the story a long time ago. I woke up about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and man, I had it down. I was writing it down. I was going to do this, and I had it all together. And in the morning when I woke up, I was so excited. I woke up, looked at my notes. I had no idea what I was writing, what I had written. And so here's what I did. I said, we're gonna look at Lewis and Clark because we're looking at two distinct categories of situations, if you will. We're going to look at the cultural history of Lewis and Clark, and we're going to look at the natural resources of Lewis and Clark of this country. And here's what we're going to do: is we're going to do it because we're American Indian, because we look at number 4 as a sacred sign or as a sacred number. We're going to do it in 4 arenas, if you will. The first arena we're going to do, and it's going to fit both from a cultural resource standpoint and from a natural resource standpoint, is we're going to look at what was this country like before Lewis and Clark. What was going on? Let's say in 1750. Let's say in 1700s. What was happening in this country? And we need to explain of the activity, the trade values, the trade systems that was going on without the white man being there. Just the Indian people. Were they reserving, were they looking after the natural resources like we do today? No. But they're the ones that started prescribed burning. Okay, but they do it on an annual basis, try to bring the buffalo back. They had all these different reasons. So anyway, we had to look at that. We have to look at it in that category. And the second category we have to look at is what was life like when Lewis and Clark came here? What was going on? What attracted them? What attracted Jefferson, for example, besides Louisiana Purchase, to go see what was there? Okay, so what was going on there? The third thing is what was happening in the last 200 years, because when we did this, we did the anniversary with the anniversary in the 200 years. What happened in the last 200 years? How have we changed? And look at all cultures. Look at the Indian culture. What happened to us? We're on reservations now. You know, at one time, we couldn't even use those reservations. What happened? And the last thing we're going to look at from a natural resource and a cultural resource standpoint is what are we going to look at in the next 200 years? And I always tell people that, because I find it really interesting. You look at all this beauty around here, and we look at and you want to stand on this point and look at this river in those 4 different areas of time. Before Lewis and Clark, what would you see out here? You would see magnificent. Maybe you might see herds of millions of buffalo coming through, and antelope and deer, and you would see, Indians maybe traveling on their crops. It would be beautiful. Okay, what was happening during Lewis and Clark? During Lewis and Clark, you start having the trade system a little bit. The French were here, the Spanish were here coming in, and so you had that trade system going on. And what did that do to the tribes? Okay, in the last 200 years, look at it now: farmland, houses, no buffalo, hardly any deer, hardly any antelope. And the next 200 years, what are we going to see? And I always tell people, let's stand here with Lewis and Clark and Eagle Woman, who was supposed to be Sagagawea, the Eagle Woman here, and York, and all the chiefs that were here that they met. Let's stand right here, all side by side, right now today, and look down there and say, okay, is this what we wanted? And is this what and because of that, this is what the Tent of Many Voices will do, is bring us up to that time period. Because of all these different things that the tribes have said over these years in those 4 categories, by the way. A lot of them talked about problems of today, and it's associated with that. So that Tent of Many Voices is extremely important to bring that out. The Tent of Many Voices was a mobile unit that interpreted the trail of Lewis and Clark, going through obviously everything from the early start of when Jefferson first talked about this, when they sent people to different places to talk about the medicine, to talk about even get the pirogues together and the canoes and so forth. And we were wondering, how were we going to do this? And so what we decided on was to get a semi. And we had, because we were very popular with Congress, we got $5 million a year that we went to Congress and got that, and we had no problem getting the money. Absolutely, because it was a win-win for America, and it was a feel-good thing for America. And so what we were going to do is we were going to make it showy. And so we got the best equipment ever that you could possibly order and put on that semi. The semi was beautiful. It had Lewis and Clark on it. It had some of the trail on it. It had a big photo or big image of Eagle Woman, who we mistakenly call Sagagawea. And inside was a apparatus that when you bring down the side of the semi, you could open it up into a huge tent. But I can't remember how many seats in it. A couple hundred seats in there. We had this floor, a stage, and our plan was to follow the Lewis and Clark timetable as much as we possibly could in this day and age. And so we hired drivers for it. We had a team of drivers. We had my early staff members are the ones that put it together, actually. And they would bring back to me this is what we want to do. We have little models, and I should have brought my little model. I could have showed it. We have little models of it, and so we had to determine how long it was going to take the setup, because again, we couldn't have that many people on board. We were looking at budget, obviously, and so but we did have at least 4 people that were assigned to help set it up, put everything in order. And so we had cameras, we had the whole gambit over there. And what we would do then is I had to go from city to city and from town to town when I first started this and meet with all the people. And I would first, for a long time, I met with 2 groups. Because when I called there and I called for the mayor's office or called Chamber of Commerce, no matter what town it was, from Harper's Ferry all the way to Fort Clatsop, basically, talking to everybody, I would talk to the non-Indian group first, because they were always there. They would always come be excited about it, which was great. I'm not knocking, it was great. But it was the tribes that I wanted to get involved. I really wanted to get the tribes involved. And I can remember them coming in, and some of these very reluctantly. And so the second group I had to meet with was them. And I can remember, I'll give you an example. One time I was in, I think it was Pierce, South Dakota. And I had as many of the Lakotas and Ogalalas and all the Sioux tribes were there, as many as possible. Now remember, when Lewis and Clark came in, they were trying to stop Lewis and Clark. They were trying to kill Lewis and Clark. And so they didn't want us even now today there. And so when I came in, I remember all these Native people sitting there, even the elders would sit way in the back, around the back. They wouldn't say anything. And I remember I gave them this speech. And I was talking about the benefits, talking about how we're going to interpret the Lewis and Clark's natural resources, your cultural resources in 4 different time arenas and so forth and so on. And I thought it was very good. I was so excited when I got through because everybody looked pleased. Now, way in the back room was this one old lady, I'm sure she's passed on by now, but she raised her hand. I said, any questions? I said, yes, ma'am. She stood up, looked at me. She said, I don't trust you, she said. You're nothing but an Indian bureaucrat with braids. That's what she said to me. I got to thinking, now what am I going to do? Because everybody's waiting for that little scrap, a little fight or something. I said, ma'am, you're exactly right. I am an Indian bureaucrat with braids. And because I'm an Indian bureaucrat with braids, I'm going to tell you exactly what's going on. You have 2 choices here. The first choice you have is you're going to keep your head in the sand and not share your culture with anybody, not share your culture even with your children, and let all these people that are going to be traveling along this route by your reservations or through your reservation along the river with Lewis and Clark in mind, they're going to go through it. You're not going to teach them a thing. That's your first. That's one of your options. Your second option is to not put your head in the sand and go out there and teach and educate, and let's get our cultures back on stretch again. I'm tired. I told them I'm tired of being of government control. Let's go ahead and do it. And so that went up and down, and it was met with positively. It was met with a lot of negativity sometimes, which was great. That's fine. And the biggest question that I heard, which was really interesting, and if you put some thought into this, kids, you'll understand, is the biggest question I had with the tribes is always number one was, what do you want us to say? What does that tell you? That tells you the government's been telling the Indians to say all these damn years, and we're still scared of that yet, I think. And so when they would talk to me, they said, what do you want us to say? I would say, anything you want. Anything you want. When I first started this, I had a really good strategy of keeping the content. If you're talking about natural resources, we're going to talk about natural resources. If you ever went to oral history instruction, you'll understand that if somebody starts going out, you bring them back into that realm. Indian people, you don't do that. If a person goes off over here, starts telling a story, and that story leads to you, let them go. Let them go, because in about half an hour, it'll come back and it'll touch again. And so we let them go that way. And so that was the biggest thing I had to tell the tribes. is that they could say what they want to say. And it was really interesting because most of the mouthpieces with the tribes were female, were the grandmas, were the young women, and of course kids. We now and so that was the biggest thing was letting them understand that it was their show, that we were there as a tool, and the tool included microphones, it included cameras, and so they have to be aware of all that, and they were filmed all the time, even if there was nobody in the audience. Well, sometimes there wasn't. We had some tours up here that maybe there nobody come for one show or something or two shows, but they still had to perform like there was 1,000 people there because they had that's what we had. And so that's why we had I think we have a very, very good example of Too Many Voices films in there. So that was our. I came there in 1999. Okay, the time period. They were the bicentennial was starting to take effect when I was a superintendent at the Chickasaw Recreation Area, and this was about 1998, I believe. And I got hired in 1999 to be the superintendent of the trail. And so it took us a couple of years to put it all together. It took us but at least 2 years to absolutely organize it before we could set off on it in Monticello is where we took off from. The whole administration or the whole logistics of the bicentennial was obviously thought about in DC, looking for something to do. The reason that they chose or selected the Midwest region in Omaha is because it's sort of the middle of the trail, at least. Because I mean, the Lewis and Clark Trail only goes to the Three Forks of Montana, and after that, they went to Russian territory for a while, and so that's all the trail goes anyway. But they extended it now. But it was a pretty simple thing. When I got hired, I would go there and I would hit all the different senators and congressmen in those states that were represented with Lewis Clark. And it was interesting because when I'd go in there, most of them were expecting an ask, because we go there to congressmen. It's always an ask. Can you help us do this? Can you help us get this budget? Can you help? Boom, boom, boom. And so when I went over there, it was actually a given. It was actually, this is what we're going to do, and you want to be part of it. And so I can't remember what we had. We had a congressional group of about, I think it was around 15 congressmen, I believe, that were helping us. And so it was a win-win. It was something that they could go to their states, and we can go to their states, and it'd be rah, rah, rah for everybody. And so there was absolutely nothing that was said negative about it. And I made sure that I ran my own program. I made sure because I went to my regional office first. They were great, but this was a national event. And so I kind of went around the regional office and went straight to the very regional, straight to the director of the Park Service. And him and I, he'd call me early in the mornings and we'd visit, and him and I got to be really, really close. In fact, I had about 3 different directors I did that, which was neat because this was a national Park Service event. It wasn't a state event. State had their own thing. They could do what they want to do, but we are national. And so it was a really easy sell. It was really easy getting people. If I had Secretary of Interior, for example, I would give her a call. That's when she was in there. Can't remember her name. I give her a call at almost any place I was at. She'd come on. It was a good PR thing, and it was real positive. So we had no trouble at all from the uppy-ups, and they ain't even trying to control us. Quite a few we first got there. Of course, there was our regional director, Mr. Shank, was instrumental in getting that. Cal Calabrese, the late Cal Calabrese, has passed away now. Late Cal Calabrese was very instrumental in hiring me. He's the one that hired me, actually. He's the anthropologist that I had to settle down a couple of times, but he did really good. So they were good. And my early staff, Dick Williams, just a number one. If it wasn't for him, that place wouldn't have went. Midori Raymore was our secretary at the time, and again, but that's all we had, and that's how we organized it. So those are the main ones, and the other ones I like to have mentioned and at least think about we organize is the tribal leaderships, that one, because they were just as important as my staff. I think at that time, the 10th Amendment Voices was a revolutionary idea, and because nothing else was happening. Nothing. I've never seen anything like it. Um, and it brought the communities together, both Indian and non-Indian, in the same spot. It brought I think it increased the dialogue between members. It increased the knowledge of the younger people. There was I even invited the people that they thought shouldn't be on there. I invited the KKK to come on, and of course they wouldn't, because we're a government, but they're Americans, unfortunately, and they have a story to tell. And so I was trying to get everybody on. I was trying to get the ranchers, the farmers, everybody on there, and to me, it was all positive. There was there was no vetting. I think if the people, the only thing we would be cautious of, if and we never had that happen, is cursing. People cursing on camera, and that's not too cool. Um, but if people get mad and show their emotion, there's nothing wrong with that. If they get mad and cry, that's their emotion. That's what we need to have people understand and have people see. And so we never stopped anybody from anything. And if it was, I've never seen anything when I was there that would cause us to do that either. So they were always relatively professional, but they got emotional. I mean, it was true. The four elements of interpretation that we use, involving both categories of natural resources and cultural resources, the four categories, and this was true for everybody. First, it was what was this country like before Lewis and Clark. The second was what was this life like during Lewis and Clark. The third was what was life like in the last 200 years, and the fourth was what are we doing for the future. When we first started, as a good Park Service person and a good Park Service manager, I had everything allocated in time. Okay, you're going to talk about natural resources X amount of time, then you go cultural resources X amount of time. And I grew up on a reservation. I grew up with a lot of old people, and you don't do it to old people. And so I never did that, but it was in my head. Well, I was organized, which means that when they start talking, I let them go. I let them go. And they could talk about resources for a long period of time, much as they want. They could talk about the cultural stuff. There was no allocation. There was no boundaries, if you will, other than the real crude stuff, which never happened. And that was for everybody, for Indians and non-Indians alike on that stage. These presentations were, I think, the best we've ever had when it comes to discussing natural and cultural resources, um, ever, no matter where we're at. I think these are the best, and it's still happening. It was an invitation for everybody to come out and to really bring up their past, really bring up their current situation, and really bring up the future of their people, no matter who they were. If they were Norwegian farmers, German farmers, Indian farmers, whatever, it was all the same. And that opened the door to I think an existing dialogue that we've never seen before. And to this day, I'm hoping that's still there. I'm not sure if it is or not, but I'm hoping it's still there. And so the it's good for the American public, I believe, even to this day. The wish that we had with the presentations is that we see everybody else's presentation. What that means is, as they head out as the Indian, I love to see my relatives on camera, and I like to watch them, but I know what's going on already. So what I want to do is I want to visit maybe somebody in Idaho and on the farm. I want to visit maybe a tribe in Idaho or a tribe in Washington State and how they live, and that's how we learn. Or maybe I visit a person that talks about a family farm in Kansas or wherever, and that's how we learn. And so those are extremely important for not only dialogue but for understanding one another's cultures, and to understand that we had cultures which we're sort of losing in a way, I think. The topics varied. Obviously, from a natural resource standpoint, they from the early days they talked about their impressions of what they heard, and this is for me this was interesting because they wouldn't have got that from the books. They would have got it from oral history. They would have got it from their grandfathers, who got it from their grandfathers. So it was pretty pure, I think, as far as we start talking about the natural resources. The benefit to all of us in this was the cultural history of everybody's culture coming on board, so we can understand it, so we can view it, and so we can listen to it all the time. And to me, that was one of the best things that we've done as far as bringing people on. The range of topics were they varied from A to Z. They varied from somebody talking about their children, so somebody talking about maybe a natural resource on their place. They talked about Lewis and Clark, obviously. Um, they talked about other people that came upriver, and it depending on who the audience was. We had folks come into Washington D.C. on the mall. We put this on the mall in D.C. where the Secretary of Interior came in. I think I remember giving Congressman Warner a tour and all this kind of stuff, and we had people from the East Coast that talked about their issues, which was really interesting. And so no matter where you went, you got the regional issues. Depending, it didn't matter if it was the Indian or white. You had the regional issues. I was thinking about this question about what I learned or what anything I knew I learned, and I think if it was not about Lewis and Clark themselves. It was about the tribe that I was dealing with. If it was about the Colville Indians, for example, it was something about their tribe. Nothing really about Lewis and Clark, because I've studied Lewis and Clark quite a bit, and there was nothing really astonishing that, oh, I never heard that before, but it was more about the tribes themselves, more about what they were doing when Lewis and Clark was here, and more about their culture. I've been thinking about this question a lot as far as what presentations impacted me. And the most honest answer I can get is the presentations that stood out to me the most. And that's not just because of who I am, but it was the native presentation. Not one subject matter. They're all unique. But what stood out the most was the individuals who were doing the presentations. Because if you know the tribes themselves, it was tough for them to do. And so everyone that came with emotion, everyone that came with that had feelings that you can see on, as they say, on their sleeves, those were important presentations to me. Those were unique presentations. Those are the presentations that got a lump in your throat sometimes. And but I'm hoping that of those 4 presentations I've heard, the last presentation that they would give is hope for the future. And so the question for me was always, will that lump go away when it comes to that last one? Or are we still having problems? Yes, we're still having problems. Was the bottom line answer from a lot of Shrines. But there was the whole thing was interesting. The whole thing was fulfilling. It was really fulfilling for me to see the American Indian people stand up on stage and talk, because you never see that too much in the past. And so to me, that was the first. I believe that these recordings need to be instituted in every grade school and high school studies. I really do. And you can do it regionally, you can do it statewide or whatever. And I think these are some of the most important things that we can give our future. And we're talking future of the kids. We're talking future of the education, scholastic education, and cultural education, and all those things. I think that it's so important that this is something that needs to be promoted and carried on. If we don't, it's going to sit someplace and it's going to die. And our older history is starting to do that. Our kids are starting to lose themselves with this new modern stuff, and this will bring it out. And not only with the children, but also if you get your parents involved and get your parents interested in it, and maybe this will cause you to read the Lewis and Clark journals. Maybe this will cause you to study a tribe. I'm hoping that with the result of this, we have a better understanding of one another. And so in the long run, we see somebody and we won't call them the name. in the long run, we'll see somebody as a human being, not as a color. And so I think this will help out.